A frozen settlement, a brutal trapper, a woman the whole town had written off before she ever had a chance to speak. When Dorian Hale walked past every pretty, polished daughter, they shoved in front of him and stopped, in front of Elira Vane, the woman they whispered about, laughed at, pitied. Blackridge didn't just gossip, it ignited. What followed wasn't a love story the way anyone expected. It was a survival story, a war story, and by the end of it, the people who mocked her would have to look her in the eye and reckon with every single word they said. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. Black Ridge, late autumn, the year the cold came early. The morning Dorian Hale rode into Black Ridge, 3 women had already been dressed since before sunrise. That was the kind of man he was. The kind whose arrival gave mothers nightmares and daughters impossible hope, all at the same time. Word had traveled ahead of him the way word always did in small settlements, carried by traders, inflated by boredom, and arriving about 40% larger than the truth. By the time his horse's hooves hit the frozen mud of Black Ridge's main road, half the settlement believed he owned the entire northern range. The other half believed he'd killed a bear with nothing but a skinning knife and sheer stubbornness. Neither story was entirely wrong. Dorian Hale was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than posturing, with dark hair grown too long because there was nobody on his mountain to tell him to cut it. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes so pale they looked silver in certain light. The kind of eyes that didn't blink often enough to make a person comfortable. He wore his coat open despite the cold, which was either confidence or foolishness, and from the way he sat his horse, most people settled on the former. He hadn't come to Black Ridge for supplies. He hadn't come to trade furs, though he did plenty of that farther south. He had come because his homestead needed a second person in it, and he'd finally admitted that to himself sometime around the previous February, when a 3-day blizzard had buried his door, and he'd spent those 72 hours talking to his horse just to hear a voice. The settlement didn't know that part. They knew only what they'd constructed from rumor, that Dorian Hale was looking for a wife, that his land was valuable, and that whatever woman he chose would never want for anything again, if she could survive the mountain that came with him. Elira Vane heard about his arrival the same way she heard about most things in Black Ridge, late and from someone who assumed she wouldn't care. It was old Mrs. Cutter who mentioned it, half to herself, while Elira was hauling water from the well behind the Cutter property. Mrs. Cutter had a habit of talking as though Elira were furniture, present, functional, and not really listening. "Hale's come to find himself a bride," the old woman said, squinting down the road from her porch. "Suppose every family with a daughter old enough will be pushing them forward." Elira set down one of her buckets and rolled her shoulder where it had gone tight. "Every family but mine," she said. Mrs. Cutter looked at her then. That particular look Elira had been receiving her entire life, the one that sat somewhere between pity and confirmation. "Well," the woman said, and the single word carried more weight than a sentence. Then she went back inside. Elira picked up both buckets and finished the job. She was 26 years old, which in Black Ridge meant she was past the age when women were considered prime candidates for anything. She had sharp brown eyes that missed very little, dark hair she kept braided back because there was never time for anything else, and a body that had been the subject of settlement commentary for as long as she could remember. She was heavy, had been since childhood. Not the kind of heavy that came from idleness. She worked harder than most men she knew, hauling, building, tending animals, splitting wood when her father's back gave out, which was most of the time now. She was strong in the way that didn't photograph well, that didn't get admired at socials, that people didn't notice until they needed a fence post driven into frozen ground, and she was the only one willing to do it. What she was not was pretty in the way Black Ridge understood pretty. She didn't have the narrow waist, or the delicate hands, or the particular kind of quietness that men in the settlement seemed to want in a woman. She had opinions. She stated them. She had learned early that this combination, her size plus her directness, made her invisible at best and a target at worst. Her mother had died when Elira was 12, and whatever softening influence that might have provided had gone with her. Her father, Cade Vane, was a decent enough man diminished by chronic pain and a bottle he returned to more often than he should have. He loved Elira in the distracted way of people who are mostly lost inside their own suffering. He had never, to her knowledge, done a single thing to defend her from the settlement's casual cruelty. Not once. She had stopped expecting him to.
Oh.
The day Dorian Hale made his rounds through Black Ridge, Elira was not watching. She was at the far edge of the settlement, mending a section of fence that separated the Vane property, such as it was, from the road, using wire and cold stiffened fingers because the pliers had gone missing again. She could hear the distant sound of activity toward the center of town. Laughter. The higher-pitched noise of gathered women. She didn't look up. She'd been told, indirectly, through the settlement's invisible broadcast system, that the Harmon girls had been dressed in their good clothes, that Petra Wills had her hair done for the first time since the Harvest Festival, that even Clara Moat, who was engaged to a man in the Southern Valley, had apparently been strongly suggested by her mother to at least appear available until things were settled. Elira twisted the wire with her pliers. She'd found them, and thought about none of this. Or tried to. The truth was harder than that. The truth was that she was 26 years old, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the fence, or the water hauling, or the wood splitting. She was tired of being the woman nobody saw, not even invisible in a peaceful way. Invisible in the way that meant people looked right at you and made a decision in half a second and moved on, certain they hadn't missed anything. She'd been overlooked her entire life. She was starting to wonder if that was simply what her life was. She drove a staple into the post with more force than necessary and moved to the next section. What? She didn't hear him reproach. That bothered her later. She prided herself on noticing things. But the wind had picked up from the north and it was carrying sound in the wrong direction, and she was focused on the wire. So the first she knew of Dorian Hale was when a shadow fell across the fence post she was working on, and she looked up. It was on foot, which surprised her. She'd expected a man of his reputation to stay mounted. It kept you taller than everyone else, which was generally the point. But he'd tied his horse to a post down the road and walked over, and he was standing about 6 feet from her with his hands in his coat pockets, studying the fence repair with what appeared to be genuine interest. "You're splicing that wrong," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, not theatrical about it, just low. Elira looked at the fence, then back at him. "I'm splicing it the way that holds in cold weather. That splice will hold for 1 season. Then the wire fatigues at the twist point, and you lose the whole section in a storm." "Do you want to do it?" she said. And she didn't mean it as an invitation. She meant it as a challenge. But he seemed to take it at face value. He crouched down beside the post and held out his hand for the pliers without asking permission. And something about the directness of it, no performance, no charm, made her hand them over. She watched him redo the splice. He was right. It was a better technique. She didn't say so. "Dorian Hale," he said, without looking up. "I know who you are." Figured. Small place. He finished the splice, tested it with 2 hard pulls, and stood up. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance. He handed back the pliers and looked at her the way people looked at things they were actually trying to understand. Not up and down the way men sometimes did, cataloging, just looking. "You're Vane's daughter. Elira. You do most of the work on this property?" She wasn't sure what he was asking or why. "Yes." "Thought so." He glanced at the fence line, the whole length of it. "Rest of it needs work too. That post third from the end is rotting at the base." "I know," she said. "I'm getting to it." He nodded like this was a satisfying answer, which was strange because nobody had ever found her practical statement satisfying before. They usually made people uncomfortable. He looked at her for another moment, that steady, unhurried look, and then said, "I'll find you tomorrow," and walked back to his horse. Elira stood with her pliers in her hand and watched him go. She told herself it meant nothing. Men said things. They didn't mean them. Tomorrow he'd be at the Harmon house or the Wills house, and someone's mother would have put together a proper meal, and he'd forget he'd ever spoken to the Vane girl mending fence in the cold. She went back to work. He did find her the next day. And the day after that, the settlement noticed by the second visit. Black Ridge was not a large place, and anything that deviated from the expected pattern of things got noticed fast and discussed faster. By the time Dorian Hale had stopped at the Vane property for the 3rd time in 4 days, always finding Elira rather than seeking the house, always talking to her directly, never once appearing at the door to ask for her father, the gossip had reached a temperature that could have melted the frost off the window glass. Elira heard pieces of it. "He's not serious. He's just being strange. He probably feels sorry for her. Maybe she's doing something. You know how some women are?" That last one came from Renata Harmon, whose eldest daughter Sable had been paraded before Dorian twice now, with no result. Renata said it loudly enough at the dry goods store to make sure it reached the ears she intended. Elira was 2 aisles over, examining flour she didn't have enough coin to buy, and she heard every word. She put the flour back and left without purchasing anything. The conversations she had with Dorian during those 4 days were not romantic. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind. They were practical. He asked her questions about the land, about winter preparations, about how she managed supplies, about what she knew of the mountain passes to the north. She answered honestly because she didn't know how to be otherwise, and he listened in the complete, focused way of someone who was actually processing information rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Nobody had listened to her like that before. It was disorienting. He told her about the homestead. Not proudly, matter-of-factly, the way you described a difficult situation you were committed to anyway. It sat at roughly 4,000 feet elevation on the eastern face of what the locals called Harrow Mountain, though it had other names in other languages that had been there longer. The cabin was solid but spare. There were traps to run in season, furs to cure and sell, a small herd of goats that mostly managed themselves, a kitchen garden that mostly didn't. The nearest neighboring homestead was 11 miles away. The nearest settlement of any size was Black Ridge. "It's not comfortable," he said, on the third day, sitting on the vane fence with his coat open again, like the cold didn't have opinions about that. "I want to be straight with you. Winters are hard. The isolation is harder. Most people don't do well with it." "Why are you telling me this?" Elira said. "Because I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to have accurate information before you answer." She looked at him. His pale eyes were direct. Not warm exactly. She wasn't sure warmth was something he had available in surplus, but honest in a way that felt unusual. "I'm not a man who's good at many things," he said, "but I'm honest. I'm not going to tell you the mountain is anything other than what it is. And I'm not going to pretend the offer I'm making is romantic." He paused. "It's not. It's practical. I need a partner who can work and think and handle what comes. I've watched you 4 days. You're the only person I've seen in this settlement who qualifies." Elira stared at him. Several things happened inside her chest simultaneously, none of them entirely comfortable. "That's your proposal," she said. "I haven't proposed yet. I'm explaining my reasoning." "Because nothing about this makes sense to me," she said, and her voice came out harder than she'd intended, scraped clean of whatever she'd been trying to keep tucked away. "You've had 4 days of conversation with me. You've watched every eligible woman in Black Ridge smile at you through a parlor window, and you're here, at this fence, talking to me about what qualifies someone for your mountain. So yes, please, explain your reasoning, because from where I'm standing, it sounds like pity with extra steps." I was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. "Pity is when you give someone something they can't use," he said. "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" "Asking the right person," he said, simply, like it was obvious. She said she'd think about it. She needed him to understand that she wasn't going to be decided on the spot like a bolt of fabric or a plow horse, and he seemed to find this reasonable. He said he'd be in Black Ridge 2 more days before he headed back to the mountain. She spent the first of those 2 days being pulled apart from inside. The practical part of her said yes. The practical part of her was vivid and clear about the situation. Her father's health was declining, their property was mortgaged against a debt that she couldn't see a path to settling, and her options in Black Ridge were limited to diminishing returns. She had been surviving rather than living for years now, and the gap between the two had been widening. The other part of her, the part she kept quieter because quieter was safer, said yes for a different reason, and that reason frightened her because it had to do with the way he listened, and the way he'd fixed her fence splice without making it about the fixing, and the way he'd been honest when he had no reason to be. That part was dangerous because it wanted things, and wanting things had historically been how she got hurt. Her father found her sitting at the kitchen table that evening, not eating the supper she'd cooked. "Heard Hale's been around," Cade said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had filed several complaints. "Yes." "What does he want?" Elira looked at her father. He wasn't asking what she thought he was asking. There was no calculation in his eyes, no fatherly protectiveness rising to the surface. He was asking the question the way he asked most questions now, as though the answer were information he needed to sort, but couldn't quite reach the energy to actually care about. He's asked me to consider his homestead, she said. Cade was quiet. Then, the mountain place? Yes. Hard life up there. I know. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought, hoped, briefly, that something was going to shift behind his eyes, that some piece of fatherhood that had been banked down low was going to find oxygen and catch. But instead he just said, "Well, you're old enough to decide," and reached for the bottle he kept on the shelf beside the table. Elira excused herself and went to bed. She stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. Then she made her decision. She told him the next morning at the well, because there was nowhere else to go where they wouldn't be watched, and she didn't care anymore about being watched. "Yes," she said, before he could say anything. "But I have conditions." Something moved in his face, not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction. Something quieter. "All right. My father's debt, 2/3 of it, I need it settled before I leave." He nodded. "That's reasonable. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not up there. If something needs saying, I'll say it. I'd prefer that. And if it doesn't work, if after one winter I decide the mountain and I don't agree, I come back to Black Ridge with enough to start something of my own. Not beholden to you or anyone." He studied her. "What makes you think it won't work?" "I don't know that it will," she said. "And I'm not willing to bet everything on something I don't know." A pause. The well rope swayed in the wind between them. "Fair enough," he said. The settlement exploded. Not quietly, not in the restrained way of people who understand that their reaction is unbecoming. Black Ridge exploded the way small places do when something violates the story they've been telling themselves, loudly and all at once, and with a conviction that this particular eruption was somehow righteous. Renata Harmon, who had dressed her daughter Sable in her best clothes twice now for nothing, arrived at the dry goods store the morning after the news spread and announced loudly that Dorian Hale had clearly lost his mind from too many winters alone. That was the charitable interpretation. Her second interpretation, delivered with the particular sweetness of a woman who's decided to wound carefully, was that Elira Vane had somehow angled for this. Positioned herself. "You know how some women work," she said again, and this time more people were in the store to hear it. Sable herself said nothing, which Elira might have respected if the look on Sable's face weren't so naked in its contempt. The Wills family was more restrained but conveyed their bafflement through strategic silence and the kind of pointed non-greetings that function as a social form of commentary. What nobody did, not one person in Black Ridge, was consider the possibility that Dorian had simply made a sound decision. Elira's father gave her something on the morning she was preparing to leave. She was in the yard loading the small collection of things she was bringing onto Dorian's pack horse, practical items, tools, the heavy coat her mother had left behind that still fit, books she'd read 6 times each and couldn't leave. When Cade came out the door holding something, it was a compass, old, battered, the brass gone green in one corner. Her mother's, she realized. She'd forgotten they had it. "She was good in the wild," Cade said, meaning her mother. "Better than me. Always knew where she was going." He held it out. His hand shook slightly. Age or the bottle or something else. "Take it." Elira took it. She turned it in her hands. "I'm sorry," her father said. And she looked up, and for once his eyes were clear. I know this wasn't Papa," she said, because she couldn't let him finish that sentence without coming apart in the yard in front of her packed horse, and she didn't have room for that. "I know." She put the compass in her coat pocket. She picked up her bag. Dorian was waiting at the road. He gave her father a short, respectful nod. The nod of a man acknowledging something he understood even without the details. And then they left Black Ridge behind. Elira did not look back. She'd learned a long time ago that looking back was expensive. The road to Harrow Mountain started as a road and became a suggestion, and then became nothing a person without knowledge would follow voluntarily. It climbed through stands of black pine so dense they blocked the sky, over creek crossings where the water was already beginning to ice at the edges despite it being only early autumn, across open ridgelines where the wind came at you horizontal, impersonal. Elira said nothing for the first 2 hours. Neither did Dorian. This was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She'd spent enough of her life in the company of silence that felt hostile, the silence of people who'd decided not to include her, to know the difference between that and the silence of someone who simply didn't feel the need to fill air with sound. Around midday he stopped at a creek, and they watered the horses and ate without sitting down, standing on the bank and chewing dried meat and looking at the water. Ask whatever you're thinking, he said, without looking at her. How do you know I'm thinking something? You've got a thinking face. She ate a piece of dried meat and considered. The goats, she said. What about them? You said they mostly managed themselves. What does that mean exactly? Because goats left entirely to themselves manage themselves right off a cliff. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. Doreen manages them, he said. Doreen is a goat. Doreen is the eldest. She runs things. The others follow her. Elira looked at him. You named your lead goat Doreen. She named herself. Some animals do that. They just become a name, and you catch up to it eventually. She thought about that while they packed up and got back on the horses. It was a strange thing to say. It was also not wrong. By the time the homestead came into view late that afternoon, a solid, square-built structure of logs gone dark with weather, set into a hillside with a confidence that suggested it had decided to stay there. The last of the light was going orange over the western peaks, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since noon. The goats were in the yard. One of them, larger than the others, with a calm, assessing look that was frankly unnerving, stood slightly apart from the group and regarded the arrivals. That's Doreen, Dorian said. Elira looked at the goat. The goat looked at Elira. She'll decide if she approves of you within the first week, Dorian said, swinging down from his horse. Easier to have her on side. Is this a test? Everything up here's a test, he said, and it wasn't melodramatic. He said it the way you'd say the creek runs north or the east trap line checks better in the morning. A fact. A piece of information for navigation. Elira swung down from her own horse and faced the homestead and the cold and the odd, assessing goat and the man who had chosen her when nobody else had, for reasons she still didn't entirely understand. She had made a decision. The mountain was going to test it. She intended to make the mountain work for that. Inside the cabin, when she found it, 2 rooms, low ceilings, a stone fireplace that heated the main room efficiently, a wood stove in what passed for a kitchen, a sleeping area separated by a heavy curtain that was either Dorian's accommodation for her dignity or simply how he'd always divided the space. She found the fireplace already stocked with wood. He'd laid it before they left, she realized. Prepared for her arrival in the only way he knew to prepare. She lit the fire. She unpacked her things. She hung her mother's coat on the peg by the door where it would be easy to reach in the morning. In the kitchen, she found the staples: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, and assessed what was there against what would need supplementing and what could be stretched. She found a notebook and made a list. She made a second list of what she'd need to understand about the trap lines, the goats, the cache systems, the water source before the real cold hit. She could hear Dorian outside, moving through the yard, checking things. He'd been gone 2 weeks, and he was taking inventory with the thoroughness of a man who knew what the mountain could do to unattended preparations. She started the coffee because it was there and it was cold, and it seemed like a thing that needed doing. When he came in an hour later, stamping snow from his boots at the door, the fire was built high, and the coffee was done. And she'd already started something from the beans on the stove because they needed to eat, and she didn't see the point in waiting. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the cabin and then at her. Caches are set fine, she said, not looking up from the stove. I checked the stores while you were out. We're short on lamp oil for a hard winter. I'd say that needs to be addressed before the first real snow. He took off his coat and hung it. He sat down at the table and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the warmer. The south trap line is going to need new stakes in 2 places, he said. I'll walk you through it tomorrow. Good, she said. They ate without ceremony. The fire worked at the cold. Outside, the wind was starting to move through the pines with the low sound that meant it meant business. Elira had lived in borrowed spaces her whole life. Spaces that felt temporary, conditional, subject to withdrawal at any moment. She sat in the cabin that first night with coffee she'd made in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, and listened to a mountain that didn't know her name and thought, this is the hardest thing I have ever chosen to do. Then she thought, good. She'd always done better with hard things. Comfortable had never really been her territory. Doreen the goat could be heard from the yard, making sounds that were either commentary or settling in for the night. Elira decided it was the latter. She washed the dishes in the basin, put them away in the cupboard, and went to bed. The mountain held. She held back. In Black Ridge, the mockery had not finished with her yet. But Elira Vane was 4,000 feet above it now, and the cold, honest air of Harrow Mountain cared nothing for what a settlement thought of a woman's size or worth. It only cared what she could do. And she was just beginning. The first week on Harrow Mountain did not break her, but it came close on day 3. That was the day Elira learned that the water source, a spring-fed channel that ran along the north side of the property and fed into a collection cistern beside the cabin, froze solid every night and had to be broken open each morning before anything else could happen. Not chipped at politely. Broken. With an iron bar kept specifically for that purpose, leaning against the cabin's north wall where she hadn't noticed it because she hadn't known to look. She discovered this at 5 in the morning when she went out with a bucket and found ice 2 inches thick where water should have been. She went back inside, found the bar, went back out, and spent 40 minutes breaking through it in the dark, with her breath coming out in clouds and her shoulders burning and the cold working through her gloves like it had opinions about her being there. When she came back inside, hands raw, Dorian was up and had the stove lit. He looked at her, then at the bar she'd propped back against the wall inside the door. "Found the morning job," he said. "Would have been useful information yesterday," she said. "Would have," he agreed, without particular apology. She put the bucket down harder than she needed to and started on breakfast. He said nothing about the noise. She appreciated that more than she expected to. By the end of that first week, she had mapped the homestead's rhythms with the same methodical attention she'd applied to her notebook lists. The spring line in the morning. The goats fed before the temperature peaked at midday because they ate better warm. The trap line to the south that Dorian checked every 2 days, which she started accompanying him on after the 3rd day because she was not going to spend a winter not knowing how the place worked. The firewood. Always more than you thought you needed, stacked in the right order for weather, the driest wood accessible at the front. Dorian was not a patient teacher by nature. He explained things once, clearly, and then expected you to have them. She matched him. She asked questions when she genuinely didn't know something and not otherwise, because she'd observed quickly that the questions he respected were the ones that came from actual gaps rather than performance. He seemed to respect her knowledge when it surfaced, too. Her understanding of plant medicines from the forest margin, her efficiency in the kitchen that stretched supplies further than he'd managed, her eye for structural problems in fencing and storage that she'd developed from years of maintaining a property on her own. They were not easy with each other, but they were honest, and honest had its own rough functionality. What she hadn't prepared for was how loud the silence was at night. Not the mountain's silence. That was full, active. The sound of wind and wood settling and distant animals, and the fire working through its logs. She liked that. What she hadn't prepared for was the silence of being in a space with another person who also didn't fill quiet with noise, and realizing that the quiet between them wasn't hostile, but wasn't yet comfortable either, and not knowing what it was working toward. She wrote letters to her father by the fire some evenings. She didn't know if she'd send them. She wrote them anyway. Dorian Reed. He had more books than she'd expected. Technical things mostly, trapping guides and surveying texts, but also a battered collection of histories that he'd apparently been working through for years based on the condition of the pages. Once she saw him reading one of hers, she'd left a novel on the table. And when she didn't say anything about it, he finished it 3 nights later and put it back without comment. She counted this as communication. By the 2nd week, Black Ridge had mostly stopped feeling like a wound she was carrying and started feeling like something that had happened to a previous version of her. The mountain required too much present tense attention to leave much room for anything else. Then the first rider came up. It was a Thursday, or what passed for Thursday, on a mountain where the days had more to do with weather patterns than calendar squares. Elira was in the yard working on the fence section that bordered the goat pen. Dorian had been right about that post. It had needed replacing. When she heard the horse, she straightened and watched the trail. The rider was a man she recognized from Black Ridge, which immediately put her shoulders up. His name was Garrett Webb, and he was somewhere in his mid-30s, the kind of man who was good-looking in a way he'd built his entire personality around. He'd been one of the settlement's more vocal commentators on Dorian's choice. She'd heard secondhand that he'd said, in the tavern, that Hale must have gone simple from altitude. He rode into the yard with the easy confidence of a man who'd decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. "Hale around?" he said, looking past Elira. "He's on the south line," she said. "Back by mid-afternoon." Garrett Webb looked at her then. Really looked, the appraising way that was meant to be felt as a reminder of her place in the social order. Settlement's been talking, he said. Thought someone should come up, check on things. Things are fine, Elira said. Just seems like Dorian made a fast decision. Man makes a fast decision out here. Can go wrong for him. Elira held the fence post she'd been about to drive in. It was a solid piece of wood, about 4 feet long, and she was aware of it in her hand in a way that required some internal management. I'll tell him you came by, she said. No need. Garrett swung down from his horse without invitation and tied it to the rail beside the cabin door. I'll wait. There wasn't a rule against it that she could state plainly, and he knew that. She watched him settle himself on the rail with the ease of a man who'd never had to examine whether his comfort was earned. Then she turned back to the fence post and drove it into the frozen ground with a force that made Garrett Webb go slightly quieter. When Dorian came back 3 hours later and found Garrett Webb at his rail, his face said nothing specific but something narrowed behind his eyes. He nodded once. Webb. Dorian. Garrett pushed off the rail. Settlement wanted me to check in, make sure everything was in order. Everything's in order, Dorian said, tying his horse. She working out all right? Garrett said, and he didn't look at Elira when he said it, which was somehow worse than if he had. Like she was livestock they were evaluating. Dorian looked at Garrett for a moment with the particular stillness of a man deciding something. She keeps the place better than I did alone, he said. Spotted 2 problems in the south storage I'd missed for a year. That answer your question? Garrett smiled like it was all very genial and harmless. Just checking in, he said again. He untied his horse. He looked at Elira once more before he mounted, a look that said this conversation wasn't over, just relocated. Settlement misses you, Dorian. Come down sometime. He rode out. Dorian watched him until the trees took him. How long was he here? He said. 3 hours. A pause. He say anything? Nothing that mattered, Elira said. Dorian looked at her. Whatever he was reading in her face seemed to satisfy him. He went inside. She stayed in the yard a moment longer, watching the trail where Garrett Webb had gone, and something she'd been trying to name since arriving on the mountain finally settled into clarity. The hostility hadn't stayed in Black Ridge. It had followed her up here, wearing different coats, traveling on horses, calling itself concern. She drove the last fence post in and went inside. What she hadn't anticipated, and this showed a gap in her thinking she'd later be grateful to fill, was that the mountain itself would offer something she hadn't known she was missing. It started small. She went with Dorian to the eastern ridgeline one clear morning, ostensibly to check a cache he'd set there the previous spring, and she stood at the edge of the ridge and looked out over the valley below, and understood for the first time what a person looked like from 4,000 feet. Very small, arranged in rows, manageable from a distance. She'd spent her whole life at ground level, where everything and everyone was right in her face, where every opinion landed without reduction. Up here things were in proportion. The settlement below was a collection of buildings. The people in it were specks. Their voices, which had followed her like bad weather her whole life, could not climb this high. She didn't say any of this, but she breathed differently on the way back down, and Dorian noticed even if he said nothing about it. He noticed things the way she did, cataloging rather than commenting, storing information and finding uses for it later. It was the quality she found she respected most in him because it matched something in herself that had never been matched before. Garrett Webb will come back, she said that evening. They were eating, the fire building itself up the way it did after the temperature outside fell. Dorian looked up from his plate. Probably. He's not the only one who'll come? No. He ate. Black Ridge has opinions about things it doesn't understand. Always has. They think you made a mistake. I know what they think. She pushed food around her plate. Do you? She said it without edge, a genuine question. Because it sounds like what they think is that you lost your sense somewhere and chose wrong, and that they're waiting for you to admit it. Dorian was quiet for long enough that she looked up. His pale eyes were on her, steady. I don't explain my choices to people who've already decided I'm wrong, he said. Waste of time. And if they make it more than an opinion? Something shifted in his face. Not much, a degree or two, like a compass needle finding a new direction. What do you mean? Webb wasn't just checking in, she said. He was measuring. He's deciding something. Dorian set his fork down. He was listening the way he listened to her on the practical matters, fully, without deflection. What makes you say so? The way he looked at the property. Not at you, not at me. at the land, like he was calculating something. She'd grown up watching people who wanted what other people had and couldn't say so directly. She recognized that particular quality of attention. I don't know what he thinks he has a claim to, but he thinks something. Dorian was quiet for a while after that. The fire worked its way through a log and resettled. There's a dispute, he said finally. Old one. From before I built here. Webb's family had a grazing claim on part of this land went back 20 years. They let it lapse. I bought the title legally, but Garrett Webb has never accepted that his father let it go. Elira absorbed this, and he saw your decision to take a wife as a sign I'm putting down permanent roots, Dorian said, which I am, which makes the land question more pressing for him than it was when I was up here alone and might leave any winter. She thought about this. She thought about Garrett Webb's eyes on the fence line, on the storage structures, on the goat pen, measuring. He's going to try something, she said. Probably. Then we need to be ready for that. Dorian looked at her across the table, that direct, unhurried look she'd first seen at the fence in Black Ridge, back when she'd thought it meant pity. She'd reclassified it since then. It wasn't pity. It was the look of a man who took things seriously and considered her one of those things. We, he said. Not a correction, just noting it. We, she said back, firm. Something about his posture changed slightly, like a thing that had been held at tension for a long time eased by a degree. He picked his fork back up. All right, he said. Well, Doreen approved of her on the 11th day. The goat walked up to her while she was filling the water trough, sniffed her boot, then her coat hem, then stood for approximately 30 seconds in what Elira could only describe as deliberate assessment. Then Doreen turned around and went back to the others. That's it? Elira said. Dorian, watching from the fence, said, That's it. How do you know she approved? She didn't headbutt you. Elira looked at the retreating goat. And if she had? She'd have kept doing it until you either left or established that you weren't going to. He paused. She headbutted me for the first 6 months, every morning. What changed? I stopped flinching, he said. Elira stood there with the bucket in her hand and thought about that for a while. She started to understand, that month on the mountain, that most of what looked like hardness in Dorian Hale was actually just honesty with the performance removed. He didn't tell her things were fine when they weren't. He didn't smooth over problems to avoid the friction of discussing them. When he was tired, he said so. When something she'd done was wrong, he said that too, once, directly, without circling it or softening it, and then the matter was done and not returned to. She did the same. It was the first relationship of any kind in her life, friendship, family, the arrangement this was becoming, where she hadn't spent energy managing the other person's comfort at the expense of her own honesty. It was strange. It was also, underneath the strangeness, something she might have called relief. One evening in their third week, she was reading by the fire when she heard him say her name. Elira. She looked up. He was at the table, not looking at her, working on some calculation in a ledger. His jaw was set in the way it got when something was costing him more than the task should. The debt, he said. Your father's. It's settled. I sent the payment with the rider that came up from Teller's Post last week. She'd known he'd said he would. Knowing it was done was different. She looked at the fire for a moment. Thank you, she said. He didn't look up from the ledger. You already earned it. She went back to her book. Outside, the wind had found its winter voice, lower, more insistent, a sound that meant the season was changing its mind about being lenient. The cabin held against it. The fire held. She held. 3 weeks on Harrow Mountain, and Elira Vane had stopped waiting to be sent back down. She was still waiting for what was coming up, because something was. She could feel it the way the mountain felt weather, that particular pressure shift in the air that meant conditions were changing whether you were ready or not. She was getting ready. The second rider came up in early December, and this one brought a letter. It was from the land office in Teller's Post, the nearest administrative settlement of any size 2 days' ride south in good weather. Dorian read it at the table while Elira finished the morning's bread, and she knew from the quality of his silence that it was bad before he said a word. He had different kinds of quiet. She'd learned to read them the way you learn to read weather on an open ridgeline, the texture of it, what it was building toward. This particular silence had weight. Webb filed a petition, he said. She set down the bread. For the land claim. For review of the title transfer. He's arguing the original sale was improper. that his father signed under duress. He put the letter on the table. It's not a serious legal argument, but it doesn't have to be. A petition triggers a review period. During review, any permanent improvements to the property can be contested. Elira looked at him. Meaning everything we've built this fall. Meaning everything. She sat down across from him and looked at the letter. The writing was formal, bureaucratic, the language of institutions that moved slowly and ground small things to powder without particular malice, just procedure. She'd seen that language applied to her father's debt notices. She knew what it could do. How long is the review period? 60 days. If they rule in Webb's favor on the petition, we go to a formal hearing. That's another 4 months minimum. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we're here, Dorian said. But Webb knows that a hearing in Teller's Post means I have to appear in person. Multiple times. Which means leaving the mountain in winter. Elira understood the geometry of it immediately, the way she understood most practical problems. Not because someone explained it, but because she could see the shape of it. Webb wasn't necessarily going to win the legal argument. He didn't need to. He needed Dorian off the mountain long enough for the cold and the unattended homestead to do the rest. A winter without someone managing the water channel, the stores, the structures. Pipes bursting. Roof loading up with snow and no one to clear it. The goats without proper management. A dozen small catastrophes adding up to the kind of damage that took years to recover from, if you recovered at all. He timed it, she said. Yes. He waited until we were established enough that abandoning it would hurt, but filed before we were established enough to weather the disruption. She looked at the letter again. This isn't spontaneous, he thought about it. Dorian was watching her in the way he'd watched her since the beginning, that focused, taking inventory look. You see it faster than I do, he said. Not a compliment exactly, an observation. I grew up watching people work angles they couldn't afford to be direct about, she said. You learned the shape of it. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northeast, which on Harrow Mountain was the direction that meant business. She could hear Doreen moving the others around in the pen. The eldest goat had a sense for incoming weather that was more reliable than anything Elira had encountered. What are you thinking? Dorian said. I'm thinking that Webb assumes this plays the same whether you go to Teller's Post or not, she said. If you go, the mountain suffers. If you don't go, the petition proceeds unopposed. Either way, he wins something. That's what he's counting on. Then we need to change what he's counting on. She folded her hands on the table. What would it take to get the petition dismissed outright? Not just contested, dismissed, before it reaches the review stage, Dorian thought. Original documentation of the sale, not copies. The original transfer agreement with his father's signature and the notary seal. If that's filed in Teller's Post with a counterpetition, the burden of proof shifts to Webb. He has to prove duress, not just allege it. Where's the original documentation? A pause. Teller's Post. In the land office. Then someone needs to go to Teller's Post, she said. File the counterpetition. Pull the original documents. And it can't be you because that's what he's waiting for. You leaving the mountain in winter. Dorian looked at her steadily. You're not suggesting, I can make the ride in 3 days if the pass stays open, she said. The northern approach. Webb won't be watching that route because it's the harder one. It's not just harder, he said, and his voice had shifted into something she hadn't heard from him before. Not quite alarm, because he wasn't a man who alarmed easily, but something close to it, something personal underneath the practical. The northern pass in December is not a route I'd take alone. The trail ices in sections that don't look iced until you're already on them. There are 2 creek crossings that run under thin ice this time of year. If you go through, I know what happens if I go through, she said. Elira. I know how to read ice, she said, and I know the pass is passable because you told me so yourself 3 weeks ago when you were explaining the alternative supply routes. You said the northern way adds 2 days but stays navigable until January in a light winter, and this is a light winter so far. I was quiet. She could see him sorting through the argument he wanted to make, which was the emotional one, the one about danger and uncertainty and the specific vulnerability of a person alone on a mountain trail in December, and the recognition that she was right about the practical case and he didn't have a counter that held up. You've never ridden that route, he said finally. No, but I have your description of it, and I have a compass, and I am not someone who gets lost. She held his gaze. You need to stay here. The homestead can't run itself for 3 days in December, And if something happens to the water channel or the roof load while you're gone, it costs us more than the petition already does. This is the math. I know you see it." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the weight of it. "I don't like it," he said. "I know. That's not me saying you can't handle it. I want to be clear about that." "I know that too," she said, and she meant it. She'd learned by now the difference between his doubt of her and his doubt of the situation. This was the latter, and she respected him for making the distinction out loud. He stood up and went to the shelf where the maps were kept. Hand-drawn things, detailed and worn at the folds, covered in the small notations of a man who'd learned his territory through years of direct argument with it. He spread the Northern Pass map on the table and spent 20 minutes walking her through every section she needed to know. The ice-prone stretches and how to identify them from the approach. The creek crossings and the correct angles. The waypoint shelter at the halfway mark. A stone structure built by a trapper 20 years back where she could stop if weather moved in. The signs that weather was moving in. She memorized everything. She asked 3 questions, the kind that came from genuine gaps. That night he made coffee, though it was late and neither of them mentioned sleep for a while. The fire burned lower. Outside the wind continued its position from the northeast. "If something happens to you on that pass," he said, "it won't. Elira, if something, then you file the counter petition yourself in spring and you beat Webb in the hearing and you name one of the goats after me," she said. "But nothing is going to happen." He looked at the fire. "You've never had someone to worry about before," she said. Not cruelly, observationally, the way she said most things. "It's uncomfortable." "Yes," he said. She didn't tell him it meant something to her, that discomfort of his. She didn't have the right words for it yet, and she wasn't going to use the wrong ones. But she sat with it quietly while the fire worked down to coals, and it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the firewood. She left before dawn. The Northern Pass was everything he'd described, and a few things he hadn't. The first section climbed through dense forest where the trail was obvious, then broke out onto an exposed ridgeline where the wind hit her like a wall with an argument. She kept the horse slow and deliberate over the iced sections, reading the surface the way she'd been taught to read everything, not from instruction but from observation. The particular dullness of ice under snow versus the slight crystalline shine of what was solid underneath. She found the first creek crossing by mid-morning and spent 15 minutes reading the surface before she took the horse across, angled slightly upstream the way Dorian had said, maintaining momentum without rushing. The ice held. The horse didn't like it but trusted her hands on the reins, which was its own small vote of confidence she took seriously. She reached the waypoint shelter by early afternoon. It was small and stone-walled and smelled of old fires and the particular mustiness of spaces that kept weather out but couldn't do much about time. She built a small fire in the stone circle, ate, let the horse rest, and looked at the map again, though she didn't need to. She just wanted to be sure. She thought about Black Ridge while she sat there, about Renata Harmon and Garrett Webb and her father's face when she'd left, about the settlement waiting, she imagined, for news of some failure. Some proof that Dorian had made the mistake they'd decided he'd made. She thought about Dorian on the mountain behind her, alone with the goats and the water channel and the particular silence of a person who has learned to be alone but recently acquired a reason not to want to be. She finished her food and put the fire out carefully and got back on the horse. Teller's Post came into view on the 3rd morning, earlier than she'd estimated, which she counted in the column of things that had gone right. It was a larger settlement than Black Ridge. A proper land office, a post, 2 taverns, and the kind of accumulated permanence that came from sitting on a trade route rather than beside it. The land office opened at 8. She was there at 7:45, which gave her time to be cold and impatient, and to compose in her head exactly what she was going to say and in what order. The clerk was a tired-looking man named Aldous, who had clearly been told many stories he didn't believe and processed many claims he found tedious. He looked at Elira with the particular neutrality of a bureaucrat who has trained himself not to be surprised by anything. She put Dorian's documentation on the counter. The original sale agreement, folded carefully in oilskin, the title transfer with the notary seal. The chain of ownership going back 12 years. She'd found all of it in the chest under Dorian's bed, organized with the thoroughness of a man who'd known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that he might need these things ready. "I need to file a counter petition," she said, "to the Webb Review, and I need to do it today." Aldous looked at the documents. He looked at her. "You're the Hale wife?" "I'm Elira Vane," she said. "And yes, Dorian Hale is my husband." The word sat strangely in her mouth. Not wrong, just new, like a boot not yet broken in. These are the original documents. The web petition alleges duress on the original sale. The original documents, with notary certification, establish clean transfer. I'm requesting the petition be dismissed for lack of evidentiary basis before it reaches the review stage. Aldous looked at the documents more carefully now. He picked up the notarized transfer and tilted it toward the window light. "The notary seal is Bremer's mark," he said. "He's been in good standing for 30 years. "Yes," Elira said, "and the original seller's signature matches the registry." "You can verify that against the land registry here," she said. "I'd appreciate if you did." I did. It took 40 minutes, during which she stood at the counter because there was nowhere to sit, and she'd have stood anyway. She was not going to sit down in this office and look like she was waiting for something to be decided. She was here to file. There was a difference. When Aldous came back, his expression had shifted from bureaucratic neutrality to something more like professional acknowledgement. The look of a man who has found the paperwork in order and is adjusting his prior assumptions accordingly. "The documentation is clean," he said. "Counter petition will be filed today. Given the original notary certification and unbroken title chain, the review board will likely dismiss the web petition without convening." "How likely?" she said. "Very," he said. Then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "Mrs. Hale, whoever prepared these documents prepared them well. This is not a complicated case." "No," she said, "it isn't." She rode back the southern route, which added half a day but avoided the ice crossings in the dark. She was tired in a way that had gone past the muscles and into something deeper. The fatigue of sustained alertness finally releasing its grip. She let the horse set its own pace where the trail was clear, which it was smart enough to appreciate. She was a day and a half out from the homestead when the weather changed. It came from the northwest, not the northeast that had been threatening all week, which meant it had gone around the range and come at them from the other direction. The kind of meteorological argument that mountains had with weather systems, and that people caught in the middle of had no say in. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The clouds that moved in were the heavy yellow-gray color of serious snow, not the thin white of a passing system. She made the waypoint shelter by nightfall, barely. The horse was done and so was she, and the snow that had been threatening all afternoon started in earnest around the time she got the shelter door pulled shut. She built the fire up as high as the stone circle allowed and sat close to it with the horse behind her in the back section of the shelter where 3 walls kept the worst of it off. She had 2 days of supplies. She didn't know how long the storm intended to last. She thought about Dorian, on the other side of the pass, watching the same sky from the homestead yard. She thought about the fact that he would know, from the direction and color of the weather, that she was somewhere in it. She thought about what that would be doing to him. She also thought about Garrett Webb, comfortable in Black Ridge, believing he had them pinned, not knowing she'd already filed the counterpetition, not knowing that his careful geometric plan had been walked around rather than pushed against. The fire cracked. The snow came down outside in the particular thick silence of heavy accumulation, the kind of quiet that was actually very loud if you knew how to listen. She was stuck. The pass wouldn't be crossable until the storm cleared, and a storm like this could run 2 days or 4. She didn't know which. She had enough supplies for both, barely, if she was careful. The horse was unsettled but not panicked, which was good, because panicked horses in confined spaces made everything worse. She added wood to this fire and took stock of what she had, which was her habit when things went sideways. Not the emotion first, the inventory first. Emotion after. You could feel things once you knew what you were working with. What she was working with was manageable, uncomfortable, genuinely cold even with the fire, potentially days longer than planned, but manageable. She pulled her mother's coat tighter and leaned her back against the stone wall and listened to the storm negotiate with the mountain. The mountain was not giving ground, neither was she. The storm ran 3 days. She knew it was 3 because she made a mark on the shelter wall each morning with a piece of charcoal from the fire ring, the way she'd been told her grandfather had done in a mine cave-in once, years before she was born. She'd thought that story was morbid when she was young. Now she understood it, not the morbidity, but the need. Something about marking time made it feel less like time was marking you. The horse, whose name she'd decided was Patience, because that was what the situation required of both of them, ate through most of the grain she'd packed and supplemented with hay. She found bundled in the back corner of the shelter, old but serviceable. She rationed her own food more carefully, not because she was in real danger yet, but because she was not going to arrive at danger before she'd seen it coming. She slept in intervals, waking to add wood and check the drift at the door. By the second night, the drift outside had reached her hip when she cracked it open, which meant the pass above was buried and moving would have been its own particular kind of foolishness. She went back inside. She finished one of the books she'd brought in her saddlebag, a surveying text she'd borrowed from Dorian's shelf, dense and specific, which suited her frame of mind better than fiction would have. She needed things that were concrete and solvable. On the morning of the third day, she woke to quiet. Not the storm's silence, which had weight and pressure to it. This was the other kind, the clean, exhausted quiet of weather that has finished its argument and moved on. She opened the shelter door and looked out at a world that had been remade in white. The trail buried to a depth that made it invisible. The trees waded into strange shapes. The sky above drained to a pale, luminous blue that meant cold and clear for days. She spent 2 hours digging out the trail entrance. Not all of it, just enough to lead patients through and start moving. The horse had been cooped up for 3 days and was not gracious about it, expressing opinions through the ears and a pointed refusal to stand still while she saddled up. She appreciated the honesty. Moving through post-storm snow on a mountain trail was slow work. She picked the route by reading the depressions and contours beneath the white rather than the trail surface itself, which had vanished. She'd done something similar in Black Ridge after heavy winters, navigating the settlement's back roads when the markers were buried and you had to remember the land rather than see it. The principle was the same: trust what you knew rather than what you could see. She crossed the southern descent by early afternoon and the homestead came into view an hour before dark. The log walls, the stone chimney with smoke coming from it, the goat pen with Doreen standing at the fence in what was, by now, a familiar posture of supervisory assessment. Dorian was in the yard before she reached the gate. He'd heard patients on the trail. The horse had opinions about homecoming that it was sharing with the mountain at volume. He crossed the yard in the particular way of someone who had been managing something difficult internally and was now being required to manage it externally too. And he took the horse's reins and stood looking at Elira with an expression she didn't have clean language for. 3 days, he said. Storm caught me at the waypoint shelter. She swung down, and her legs were less cooperative about it than she'd have preferred. She caught the fence with one hand. I'm fine. I can see that. The counterpetition is filed. She straightened up. Her back had thoughts about 3 days on a stone floor. Aldous at the land office said the documentation is clean. The web petition will almost certainly be dismissed without a full review. Something moved through his face, relief trying to work its way past the thing that had been sitting in front of it for 3 days. You verified the original notary certification? He verified it himself against the registry. Took 40 minutes. Came back satisfied. Dorian looked at her for a moment longer than the information required. Then he took Patience towards the stable without another word, which she understood by now was not indifference, but the opposite of it. The way he processed things that mattered, quietly and away from the surface. She went inside and stood in front of the fire and let herself be warm for the first time in 3 days. Doreen headbutted the gate twice, which Elira was choosing to interpret as welcome. The petition dismissal came back from Teller's Post in 12 days. Aldis's letter was brief and bureaucratic and entirely satisfying. The web petition had been reviewed by the land board and dismissed for insufficient evidentiary basis, with a notation that the original title documents demonstrated clean and uncontested transfer. Any future petition on the same grounds would require new evidence not present in the current filing. Dorian read it twice, folded it, and put it in the document chest. That should be the end of it, he said. Elira, who had been watching his face, said, Should be. He looked at her. You think it isn't? I think Webb didn't go to the trouble of calculating this out and then give up because of paperwork. She sat down at the table. The legal route failed. That doesn't mean he stops. It means he tries something he doesn't have to sign his name to. Dorian pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was something she'd noticed about him. When she said something he needed to think about, he sat down for it. He didn't pace or deflect. He sat down and thought. She found it one of his better qualities. The supply cache, he said after a moment. On the eastern approach. If someone wanted to make this winter significantly harder, that's where I'd start, she said. It's accessible without coming past the cabin, and losing it midwinter doesn't just hurt us. It potentially closes the eastern trade route for the families that use it as a waypoint. Webb knows the eastern approach. His family ran cattle through there for years. Yes, she said. They looked at each other across the table. I'll check the cash tomorrow, he said. We'll check it, she said. He didn't argue. The cash had been tampered with, but not yet destroyed, which told Elira it was a preliminary move, a test of whether they were paying attention. 3 of the supply containers had been moved and restacked in the wrong order. Someone who didn't know the system wouldn't have noticed. She knew the system because she'd cataloged it in her first week and memorized the arrangement the way she memorized everything practical, completely and for keeps. Someone's been here within the last week, she said, crouching beside the restacked containers. Before the storm, because the prints are filled in. But look at the stacking order, large to small, front to back. Dorian, how do you stack these? Small in front for access, he said, crouching beside her. He was looking at the containers with the focused look she recognized. Right. Whoever did this put them back wrong. Either they were in a hurry, or they didn't know enough about your system to fake it. She stood up. They weren't here to destroy yet. They were here to see what's here. What could be destroyed and when? Scouting run, Dorian said. And when we don't react, when they think we haven't noticed, they'll come back and do the actual damage. He stood beside her, looking at the cache. His jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was containing something. I want to be the one who, he started. I know you do, she said. But think about it practically. If you go after Webb directly, it becomes a land dispute with a personal violence element, and that complicates the legal situation we just resolved. What we need is documentation, evidence that holds up in front of the same land board that just ruled in our favor. You want to catch him in the act? I want to catch whoever he sends in the act, she said, and I want to do it in a way that gives us something we can take to Teller's Post with names attached. Dorian was quiet. The eastern ridge line above them was clear and white, the sky past it a hard, cold blue. There's a position on the upper trail, he said slowly. Rock formation about 200 yards above the cache. You can see the entire approach from there without being seen. How long would someone need to hold that position? 2, 3 nights. Whoever they send won't risk daylight. Then that's what we do, she said. We wait. Elira, I know it's cold and I know it's uncomfortable and I know you'd rather do it yourself, she said, because she could see all 3 of those things in his face. But 2 people watching means shifts. Means neither of us is compromised from exhaustion when whoever it is finally shows up. This is a practical argument, not an emotional one. He looked at her. She looked back. You make it very hard to be protective, he said. Good, she said. Oh. They held the position on the upper trail for 2 nights, taking turns in 4-hour shifts while the other kept a small, sheltered fire going at the rock formation. It was brutal in the specific way of cold that has found its rhythm and isn't breaking for anyone. She wore every layer she owned and still felt the cold in her back teeth. The first night produced nothing. They rotated shifts at 2-hour marks and met each time with the wordless efficiency of people who have run out of patience for anything that isn't necessary. He brought coffee in a sealed tin during the 3rd shift. She hadn't asked for it. He hadn't announced it. It was just there, still hot enough to matter. The second night, around 2 in the morning, she heard them. 2 men. She knew from the sound before she saw them. The particular careless crunch of people moving fast and quietly through snow, which was a contradiction in terms that gave them away. She stayed completely still at the rock and watched the approach. They had torches. That was the thing that struck her first. Not lanterns, torches, which meant they intended fire. This wasn't scouting. This was the destructive run, and they decided to do it quickly and completely. She moved to the signal point she and Dorian had established, a cleared line of sight to the shelter where he was keeping the rest fire, and she gave the signal, 2 quick movements of the dark lantern they'd brought for exactly this. Then she watched and counted and kept her position. Dorian arrived in 4 minutes. She heard him before she saw him and recognized the pattern of his movement, which was quieter than most men's and faster. He came up beside her at the rock, looked down at the cache, looked at the 2 men with the torches. She felt him go still beside her in the way of someone who has just understood the full scope of a thing. I know both of them, he said, very low. The taller one is Marsh Cully. He does work for Webb. The other is Webb's younger brother. Webb sent family, she said. He's more invested than I thought. Or more desperate, she said. Same result. The two men had reached the cache. She watched them work with the cold, clear attention she'd given to every difficult thing in her life. Not flinching, not rushing, just watching and noting and remembering. I have a better angle from the east approach, she said. He looked at her. If we move now, they're between us and the cache. We have the higher ground on two sides. They're not going to outrun both of us in this snow, and they won't want to. She pulled the dark lantern from her coat. And we have this. It was not a weapon. It was a lantern with a full oil reservoir and a shutter she could open to full blaze in a second. It was brighter than both their torches, and it would come from above, from a direction they weren't watching, at a moment they weren't ready. Dorian looked at the lantern. He looked at her. On your move, he said. And he trusted her, which still surprised her at moments, the plain and uncomplicated fact of it. She went east along the upper trail in a wide arc, moving as quietly as she could in the snow, which was not perfectly quiet, but quiet enough. She reached the position, a shelf of rock above the cache's eastern wall, just as the two men below were working at the first of the container seals. She opened the lantern. The light hit them from above and behind simultaneously. She'd timed it to Dorian's movement, watched him reach the western approach, and opened the shutter the moment he stepped into their sight line. 2 directions at once, and the brightness of the full lantern after 2 hours of darkness was disorienting in a way she'd calculated on. Both men froze. Dorian stepped into the edge of the light, and she watched from above as he stood there looking at the two of them, with the particular stillness that she'd learned was his most dangerous mode. Not raised voice, not movement, just absolute stillness, and that pale-eyed look that suggested consequences were being seriously considered. Marsh, he said. The name was flat and even. Put the torch in the snow. Marsh Cully looked at his companion. His companion looked at Marsh. They were doing the arithmetic of the situation, which took about 3 seconds. Marsh put the torch in the snow. Now the other one, Dorian said. The second torch went down. Alira came down from the shelf, picking her way carefully along the approach, the lantern still open. She reached the cache level and stood on the other side of it from Dorian, so the two men were between them, and she looked at Webb's brother, a younger version of Garrett, with less polish and more visible nerves, and she said, "What's your name?" The young man blinked at being addressed by her. He'd expected Dorian. She could see him recalibrating. "Rennick," he said. "Rennick Webb," she said. So Garrett sent his brother. She looked at Marsh Cully, who was a hired man and who had the particular expression of someone who had just realized the payment was not going to be worth the situation. And Garrett's hired hand, at 2 in the morning, with torches. She looked at the extinguished torches in the snow. To what? Check the inventory? At 2 in the morning? Rennick Webb said nothing. "I want you to think very carefully about the next thing you say," she said, "because the teller's post-land board just dismissed your brother's petition 12 days ago. And right now you're standing in front of 2 witnesses with the torches you brought to burn this cache in your hands." She held up the lantern so the light reached all of their faces clearly. "What you say next determines whether this stays a private conversation or becomes a formal matter." Marsh Cully said, "We were just... Garrett asked us to..." and then stopped himself, which was too late. Alira waited. Rennick Webb looked at his boots. He was young, maybe 20, 21, and he looked right now very young. "Garrett said if we burned the cache, the trade families would blame Hale for losing the supplies," he said quietly. "Said it would turn people against him, get the settlement to push for a new land review." Dorian was very still. "He planned to use other families' losses," Alira said, "as a lever." Rennick didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Here's what happens now," Alira said, and her voice was level and careful because she was angry in the particular cold way she'd learned to be angry. Not heat, not explosion, but something that knew what it wanted and had decided to get it by the most efficient route. "You're both going to ride back to Black Ridge tonight. You're going to tell Garrett Webb exactly what happened here and that we have 2 witnesses, her and him, to what you said, what you carried, and what you intended. And you're going to tell him that if anything happens to this cache, to our homestead, to our supply lines, or to us, the full account goes to Teller's Post with both your names on it." She looked at Rennick. "Your brother put you in front of this," she said. "You're young enough that matters. Don't let him do it again." Rennick Webb looked at her, really looked at her, for what she suspected was the first time since he'd arrived. And something in his face shifted. She didn't know what to call it. Recognition, maybe. The particular look of someone who has just seen a thing clearly that they'd been told to see differently. He picked up his unlit torch from the snow. "We're going," he said to Marsh. They went. Dorian and Elira stood at the cache and listened to the horses move away through the trees until the sound was gone. The mountain was quiet around them. The cold had opinions. The lantern flame burned steadily in the still air. "You let them go," Dorian said. Not an accusation, an observation he was examining. "Keeping them doesn't get us more than letting them go with that message," she said. "Webb needed to know we know, and Rennick needed to go home and think about what his brother is asking of him. You think he'll push back on Garrett? I think he's going to go home and feel terrible for 3 days and then decide he doesn't want to do this anymore," she said. "Whether that changes anything depends on Garrett, but it's one less piece he controls." Dorian looked at the cache, intact, undamaged, everything exactly where it should be. He looked at the extinguished torches in the snow. "We should document this," he said. "We should document this," she agreed. "Tomorrow. In writing. Signed by both of us. Dated. In case it goes further. In case it goes further." They walked back up the trail toward the homestead side by side, the lantern between them throwing a wide gold circle on the snow. She was tired in the deep way of the second night of poor sleep, added to weeks of sustained alertness. Her feet were cold in the specific way that required a fire and time and patience. Doreen was awake when they passed the pen, which was unusual and probably said something about goat perception that Elira filed away for later. The eldest goat regarded them both from the fence with her customary composure, decided they were intact and satisfactory, and turned away. Inside the cabin, Dorian rebuilt the fire, and she put the kettle on, and they sat at the table in the particular silence that follows an event that has resolved itself better than it might have. Not perfectly. She knew Garrett Webb was not done, that a man like that didn't reckon easily or fast, but the ground had shifted under him, and he didn't know it yet. "You managed that well," Dorian said. "We managed it," she said. He looked at her across the table. The fire had found its rhythm behind him, and the light it threw was warm and unsteady, the way real things were. "Elira," he said. "Yes." He seemed to be working on something, finding words for a thing he'd kept at the practical surface because that was where he lived most comfortably. She waited. She'd learned to wait for him the way she'd learned to read the ice, not impatiently, but with full attention. "I was wrong about something," he said. "When I came to Black Ridge, I told you the offer wasn't romantic, that it was practical." He looked at the table, then back at her. "That was true when I said it. It's not fully true anymore. And I thought you should know that." The fire shifted. The kettle began its approach to a boil. Elira looked at him for a moment, at the honest discomfort of a man saying something difficult, because it was true, and he decided truth mattered more than comfort. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know, Dorian, you rode out into a December storm looking for me. You had coffee ready when I was on watch duty in the cold. You learned how I drink my coffee in the first week, and you've never made it wrong since." She held his gaze. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then something happened in his face. Not quite a smile, but whatever the honest, unsentimental version of one was. "All right," he said. The kettle boiled. She made the coffee. Garrett Webb came to the mountain himself, 4 days after his brother went home. Elira was splitting wood in the yard when she heard the horse, and she knew before he cleared the tree line that it was him, not from the sound exactly, but from the feeling of something that had been building finally arriving. She kept splitting. She finished the log she was on, set the next one, split that too, and only then did she set the axe head down on the block and turn to look at him. He rode into the yard with less ease than the last time. She noticed it immediately, the set of his shoulders, the way his horse was moving slightly reluctant, as though it had absorbed its rider's uncertainty. Garrett Webb was a man who'd built his confidence on the assumption that things would arrange themselves in his favor. 4 days ago, that assumption had cracked somewhere, and he hadn't figured out yet how to carry himself without it. He stopped his horse 10 feet from her and looked at the axe in her hand, then at her face, then at the cabin behind her. "Hale here?" he said. "He's on the south line," she said. "Back by noon." Garrett looked at the sky, calculating. It was mid-morning. He'd timed this, or tried to. She wondered if he'd expected to find her alone and more manageable without Dorian present, or if he'd wanted the opposite, wanted Dorian there to make his case to. Either way, she wasn't going to perform the role he'd written for her. "I'll wait," he said. "All right," she said, and picked up the axe and went back to the wood. She was aware of him watching her. She split 4 more logs and stacked them against the cabin wall, and took her time about it. Doreen had come to the fence and was watching Garrett with the focused, unimpressed attention she reserved for things she hadn't approved. Elira found this gratifying in a way she didn't try to elevate into something more dignified than it was. When Dorian came back, he took in the scene in the yard. Webb on his horse, Elira stacking wood, the particular quality of the silence between them. And he tied his own horse to the rail and looked at Garrett. "Webb." "Dorian." Garrett swung down. He had the look of a man who'd been rehearsing something. "I think we need to talk." "Then talk," Dorian said. Garrett glanced at Elira. "She stays," Dorian said, before Garrett could frame the suggestion. Something flickered in Garrett's face. He adjusted. "Fair enough?" He put his hands in his coat pockets, a gesture she'd seen men make when they were trying to look casual about something that wasn't casual. "I want to put the land matter behind us. The petition was a legal avenue, and it closed. I accept that." "Do you?" Dorian said. "I do. And as for other things?" He paused, and the pause was doing a lot of work, trying to cover the gap where an acknowledgement of what had happened at the cache should have been. "I think there were some misunderstandings this winter. Things that got out of hand." Elira set down the axe. "Which things specifically?" she said. Garrett looked at her. He'd been directing himself toward Dorian, which was a choice she'd noticed and which she was now declining to accommodate. "There was an incident at your eastern cache," he said carefully. "Your brother and your hired man came to burn it," she said, "with torches, at 2 in the morning. We were there. We watched it happen. We have a written account signed by both of us and dated." She held his gaze. "Was that the misunderstanding you meant?" Garrett Webb was quiet for a moment. She watched him calculate. The options available, the ground he'd lost, the ground he was standing on now, which was considerably less than he'd started with. "Rennick's young," he said, "makes poor decisions." "Rennick told us whose idea it was," she said, while he was still holding the torch. Garrett's jaw tightened. For a moment something honest moved through his face, not remorse exactly, but the particular frustration of a man who has run out of angles and is being required to stand flat-footed in the truth of what he's done. She'd seen that look before. She'd spent her whole life watching people who'd treated her badly eventually arrive at the moment where they couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. Most of them found it more uncomfortable than they'd expected. "What do you want?" he said. He was talking to both of them now, finally. Dorian looked at Elira. Not for permission, for her read of it, the way he'd learned to ask her questions without words. "We want it to stop," she said. "The petition, the cache. The writers coming up to take inventory of our property. Whatever you tell your friends in Black Ridge about how this marriage happened." She kept her voice even. "We want it to stop because it needs to stop, not because you've calculated that stopping is currently the best option. I want to be clear about the difference." Garrett looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something in it was recalibrating. "You filed the counter petition yourself," he said. "Rode the Northern Pass in December." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Whatever he'd expected of her, the heavy, mocked woman from Black Ridge, the unlikely choice, the thing everyone had a confident opinion about, she could see it sitting uncomfortably against what was actually in front of him. "The families that use the eastern trade route," she said. "If that cache had burned, it wasn't just us who'd have suffered. The Pedersons' winter trade through there. The family at Miller's Crossing. You know that. You've always known that." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know if you thought of it as acceptable loss, or if you told yourself it wouldn't actually come to that. But I need you to sit with what you were willing to do." Garrett Webb looked at the ground. Just for a moment, then back up. "The land question is finished," he said. "I won't pursue it further." He looked at Dorian. "You have my word." Dorian nodded once. Sparse. Sufficient. Garrett Webb got back on his horse. He looked at Elira one more time before he turned to go, and this time the look was different from every look he'd given her before. In Black Ridge, in this yard, at the dry goods store when he'd been one of the voices saying Dorian had lost his sense. This look had something reluctant in it. Not quite respect. She wasn't going to call it that. because a thing earned reluctantly after you've tried to burn someone's livelihood down is not the same thing as respect freely given. But something that acknowledged she was a specific person with specific capabilities and that his prior assessment had been wrong. She didn't need him to say it. The look was enough. Actually, the look was more than she needed. She looked away before he rode out, because she wasn't interested in cataloging his adjustment. She had wood to finish stacking. What? She didn't know exactly when the news of the cash incident spread through Black Ridge, but it did. These things always did, carried on the same invisible current that had delivered Dorian's arrival and their departure, and every opinion the settlement had formed about both. By the time spring began making its first tentative arguments against the cold, the story had traveled, and like all stories that travel, it had changed shape in transit. What reached her father was this: that Garrett Webb had tried to sabotage the Hale homestead through the winter, that Elira had ridden the Northern Pass alone in December to file legal protection, that she had confronted two men at the Eastern Cache in the dark and sent them home with a message, and that Webb had ridden up the mountain personally and come back down having settled nothing in his favor. Cade Vane wrote her a letter. She received it with the spring supply rider, and she read it in the kitchen with her coffee while Dorian was outside, and she read it 3 times. It was not a long letter. Her father had never been a man of long sentences. He wrote that he'd heard what happened. He wrote that he wasn't surprised. And she held on that line for a moment, because he'd never said anything like that to her before in her memory, had never stated plainly that he expected her to be capable. Then he wrote that he was doing better with the bottle than he had been, that the debt being settled had taken a weight off him that he hadn't known was making everything worse, and that he hoped the mountain was treating her as well as she was apparently treating it. The last line said, "Your mother would have understood exactly why he chose you." She put the letter in the chest where she kept her mother's compass. She sat at the table for a while. Then she got up and went back to work, because that was what you did with the things that mattered most. You held them carefully for a moment, and then you carried them with you into whatever came next. Spring on Harrow Mountain was not the gentle, incremental softening that people who lived lower down experienced. It was an argument. It was the snow deciding to become water all at once. The creek crossings she'd learned to read in December, now running high and fast and loud. The mud that replaced the ice, having emphatic opinions about everything that tried to move through it. The goats were difficult in spring because everything was new again, and Doreen had to re-establish the social order after the winter's disruptions, which she did through a series of confrontations that Elira watched with more understanding than she'd have admitted to. She planted the kitchen garden in the second week of April. It was too early by the conventional calendar, but she'd been watching the soil temperature against the sun angle on the southern slope, and she'd decided the conventional calendar was being conservative. She told Dorian this. "You're going to lose the early seedlings if there's a late frost," he said. "There won't be a late frost this year," she said. "Look at the snowmelt pattern on the East Ridge. The ground temperature is running 2 weeks ahead of last year." He looked at the East Ridge. He looked at the garden plot. "You've been tracking the snowmelt pattern," he said. "Since February," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. There was no late frost. The early seedlings held. She didn't make a point of it. She didn't need to, and he acknowledged it in the way he acknowledged most things that went in her favor, with a brief, direct look that said he'd noted it and was updating accordingly. She had come to value that look more than most demonstrations she'd encountered in her life. The garden was running 3 weeks ahead of his previous yields by June. She'd reorganized the bed layout for sun exposure, added a windbreak using materials from the lumber the spring cutting had generated, and introduced a water channeling system from the North Spring that reduced the daily hauling by half. Dorian watched all of this happen with the attention he gave to anything efficient and well-designed. He started asking her questions about the channel system in the particular way he asked questions, direct, specific, genuinely interested in the answer. And she explained her reasoning, and he listened and occasionally pushed back on something, and she pushed back on his pushback, and they figured out the third version together, which was better than either of the first two. It was the best she'd been in her life. She was honest enough with herself to know that, and clear-eyed enough to understand it wasn't simple. It wasn't the mountain alone or the work alone or Dorian alone. It was the particular combination of being somewhere that required everything she had and discovering that everything she had was, in fact, enough. More than enough. She'd spent 26 years being measured by a standard that wasn't built for her, in a settlement that had decided what she was worth before she had a chance to demonstrate otherwise. The mountain had no opinions about her size or her manner or whether she smiled right. It just responded to what she did with it. That was a new thing. That was, she'd come to understand, what she'd been hungry for her whole life without knowing how to name it. It was July when the trade families came up. Not for a confrontation, for a visit. Lars Pedersen, who ran the eastern trade route and whose family had been using the cache as a waypoint for years, sent a rider ahead and arrived himself 2 days later with his wife and their eldest son, bearing supplies they'd picked up from Teller's post on commission and a bottle of something they opened at the outdoor table in the long summer evening while the mountains went orange around them. "Heard what happened this winter," Lars said. He was a big man, blunt in the way of people who work too hard to waste time on indirection. "With the cash and the web business." "Word travels," Elara said. "It does." He poured from the bottle and slid a cup across to her. "I want to say directly that if that cache had burned, it would have cost my family significantly. We winter stock through there. 3 other families do too." He looked at her. "We owe you." "You don't owe us anything," she said. "We protected our own property." "You protected more than that, and you know it," Lars said. "And you didn't have to do it the way you did it. You could have just reported to Teller's post and let the legal end handle it. Instead you stayed, watched, made sure it didn't happen in the first place." He picked up his cup. "That's someone who understands that their choices affect other people. Not everyone does." She didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She said, "The Eastern route is good business for us too. We're not separate from it." "No," Lars said, "you're not. And I'd like to discuss whether there's a more formal arrangement that recognizes that." A trade agreement. The Hale homestead is a registered waypoint on the Eastern route, with a small margin on all goods that transit through the cache. Dorian, who had been listening with his cup in his hand, looked at Elira. She looked at Lars. "What margin?" Lars named a number. She considered it. 12%, she said. "Not 10. The cache maintenance and monitoring has a real cost, and this winter demonstrated that the liability isn't theoretical." Lars looked at his wife, who looked at Elira with an expression that was surprised, and then not surprised at all, and gave a small nod. 12%, Lars said, and held out his hand. She shook it. Later that evening, after the Pedersens had made their camp in the yard, and the fire had burned low, and Dorian and Elira were inside, and the mountain had settled into its summer dark, Dorian said, "You negotiated up from his opening offer." "His opening offer had room in it," she said. "He knew it too. He would have thought less of me if I'd accepted it." Dorian looked at her with that direct, taking inventory look that she'd first seen at a fence in Black Ridge and had been trying to define ever since. She thought she had a better definition for it now. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't calculation. It was just seeing. The simple, genuine act of actually looking at a person and taking in what was there. She'd been invisible her whole life, and then this man had looked at her and seen her, and for a long time she hadn't known what to do with that. She was figuring it out. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "All of it." He said it simply, the way he said everything, without decoration, without the performance of a compliment, just the fact as he understood it. The trade negotiation, the cash, Teller's post, the garden. A pause. Being here. She was quiet for a moment. "I needed somewhere that would let me be," she said. "Most places had already decided what I was before I opened my mouth." "I know," he said. "I watched that happen for 4 days before I said anything to you." She looked at him. "You were watching before you came to the fence." "Yes." "How long?" "The first afternoon I arrived," he said. "You were hauling water from the Cutter well. Mrs. Cutter said something from the porch. I was too far to hear it. I could see your face when you answered her." He looked at his hands. "I know that look. I've had it myself. The one that says you're keeping something controlled because there's no point in not." She thought about that afternoon. She'd had no idea he was anywhere nearby. "You watched me haul water," she said. "I watched you handle a bad situation with more dignity than the situation deserved," he said, "and then go back to work." He looked up. "I knew then." The fire had gone to coals. Outside, one of the goats moved in the pen and settled again. The mountain was its summer self, warmer but not soft, never soft, just a different grade of demanding. "Dorian," she said. "Yes." "I want to go back to Black Ridge." He looked at her carefully. "Not to stay," she said, "to visit. My father's doing better, and I want—" She stopped, ordered the thought, tried again. I spent my whole life in that settlement being a certain kind of person to them. I want them to see a different one. Not to prove something, just because, she frowned, because I'm not the same woman who left, and I think I'd like to know that in that place. With those people watching. Dorian was quiet for a moment. When? Late summer, when the passes are easiest. He nodded. We'll go, he said, cha-cha. They rode into Black Ridge on a Thursday in August, which Elira would later think was a satisfying kind of symmetry. She'd left on a morning, arrived on Harrow Mountain in the late afternoon, and now she was returning in the particular gold light of a summer afternoon that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. The settlement looked smaller. She'd expected that. Distance always did that to places, but it was smaller in a specific way, like something that had seemed enormous because you were inside it, and now you could see the actual dimensions, the same buildings, the same road with its familiar ruts, the same dry goods store with its window that had reflected her face back to her for 26 years. People noticed them arrive. Of course they did. Black Ridge was still Black Ridge. Renata Harmon was on the road with her market basket, and she stopped and looked, and Elira looked back. Not with hostility. She'd worked through most of that in the long silence of winter nights, and the particular therapy of splitting wood. Not with triumph either, because she wasn't interested in that kind of accounting. Just, she looked, straight, clear. The look of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, which was a kind of freedom she'd had to ride a northern mountain pass in December to find. Renata Harmon nodded. It was small, and it cost her something, and it was real. Elira nodded back and kept riding. Her father was on the porch when they reached the house. He'd aged this year. She could see it in the way he held his back, the way he stood at the rail with a steadiness that suggested it was helping him more than it was decoration. But his eyes were clear. She'd forgotten what his eyes looked like clear. He looked younger in the eyes than he had in years. Elira, he said. She got down from her horse and hugged him, and he hugged her back with both arms the way she couldn't remember him doing since she was a child. He was thinner than he should have been, and he smelled like coffee instead of the bottle, and he held on for a moment longer than she expected. You look different, he said when she stepped back. I'm the same, she said. No, he said. And he was looking at her the way Lars Peterson had looked at her, the way she was realizing more people had started to look at her, with an attention that wasn't cataloging her deficiencies, but trying to understand what was actually there. You're not. Dorian shook her father's hand. Cade Vane shook it back with the grip of a man who was making a decision about something and had settled it, and said, Thank you for her debt, and for... He stopped. Just thank you. She settled the debt herself, Dorian said, by the third week. Cade looked at his daughter. She shrugged. Come inside, her father said. I made coffee. They stayed 3 days. On the second day, Lars Pedersen came through Black Ridge on his trade route and stopped to talk in the road, and it was a public conversation in the way road conversations were, visible, audible, part of the settlement's continuous record of itself. He talked about the Eastern Route Agreement, about the cash, about what the Hale homestead had meant for the families that depended on that corridor. People listened. People heard. The settlement's opinion of itself was a living thing, constantly negotiating between what it wanted to believe and what the evidence required. This was more evidence than it could conveniently ignore. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't interested in speeches. She bought supplies at the dry goods store and talked about prices and asked about the road conditions south and paid and left. She helped her father fix a gate that had been dragging since spring because she noticed it and had the tools, and there was no reason not to. She sat on the Vane porch in the evening and watched the settlement move through its rhythms and felt, for the first time in her life in this place, neither invisible nor exposed, just present. A person in a place with a history in it and a life outside it, both of those things real and neither of them the whole story. On the third morning before they left, Sable Harmon came to the Vane gate, Renata's daughter, the one who'd been dressed twice for Dorian's consideration and had looked at Elira with open contempt in the months before the departure. She stood at the gate and Elira went to meet her, because she wasn't going to make it harder than it needed to be. Sable was uncomfortable in showing it. She was a woman who'd been raised to be decorative and capable of social performance and not much else, which wasn't her fault and also wasn't Elira's problem, but standing here in August, she looked like someone who had spent months working up to something and now had to actually do it. I said things, Sable said, when you left, about how you'd managed Dorian somehow. Made him confused. She looked at the gate post rather than at Elira. I said those things because I was embarrassed and because it was easier than... She stopped, regrouped. It wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true when I said it. Elira looked at her. She thought about what it cost someone like Sable to come to a gate and say something honest, and she decided to receive it honestly in return rather than making it easier or harder than it was. I know, she said, and I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt because it did. But I'm also not carrying it anymore. So if you came here needing me to say that, there it is. Sable looked at her then. Something in her face simplified. Thank you, she said, small, real. Go home, Sable, Elira said, not unkindly. Sable went. The ride back to Harrow Mountain was quieter than the ride down, which suited both of them. They'd said what needed saying in Black Ridge, done what needed doing, and the mountain was ahead of them. The familiar climb through the pines, the creek crossings, the ridge line where the wind had opinions, the elevation where the air changed and the settlement fell away behind and below and became what it actually was. One place among many, full of ordinary people doing the difficult human work of deciding what to believe about the people around them. She'd been decided upon in that place, measured, found insufficient, written off. That was the history of it, and the history of it had prepared her for the cold, for the work, for the confrontations that required more than warmth or prettiness, or the particular kind of smallness that places like Black Ridge tended to reward in women. She'd been forged by what had hurt her, which wasn't poetic so much as it was just true. The fact of it wasn't fair. Most true things weren't. The homestead came into view in the late afternoon, the way it had that first time, going dark and gold in the light. She'd thought then that it looked like it had decided to stay. She understood now what it felt like to make that same decision. Doreen was at the fence. She gave them both the assessment look and then turned away satisfied, back to the business of managing the others. She's getting sentimental, Elira said. She headbutted Reniak Webb's horse on the way out that night, Dorian said, right before they cleared the gate. Elira stopped walking. You never told me that. Didn't seem necessary. She started laughing. Not politely, not at the surface, but the real kind. The kind that took her by surprise and ran longer than she expected. Dorian watched her laugh with the look of someone who found the phenomenon more satisfying than they were going to comment on. She's a good goat, Elira said, when she could. She knows it, he said. They went inside. She lit the fire. He put the kettle on, because they'd long since divided these small tasks along the lines of preference rather than habit, and making coffee was his. She sat at the table and looked at the cabin. The document chest where her mother's compass lived alongside a letter from her father, the shelf with Dorian's histories and her novels mixed together without particular organization, the windowsill where she'd started growing herbs that needed more light than they got, but tried anyway. It wasn't comfortable in the way of places designed for comfort. It was honest in the way of places that required you to be present, every day, fully, with whatever you had. She'd found that harder to come by than anyone had told her to expect, and better once found than she'd known how to imagine. The kettle came to a boil. He made the coffee the way she took it. She didn't have to tell him. Outside, Harrow Mountain held its ground the way it always had, indifferent to whether anyone approved or understood or saw value in what it was. Just itself. Hard and specific and real. She thought that was probably the right way to be. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and let it be warm.